Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain. That was the American battle cry following an explosion which destroyed the USS Maine, a battleship that was docked off the coast of Havana, Cuba in February of 1898, killing 260 U.S. seamen. Leading up to that event, U.S. tensions with Spain were high, mainly due to an independence movement in Cuba, which was under Spanish colonial rule since Christopher Columbus claimed Cuba for Spain in 1492. The Maine was one of several vessels in the region protecting U.S. interests, and there was a major movement in the United States led by noted media barons at the time, William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, to intervene on behalf of the Cuban independence movement and go to war with Spain. Despite it being unclear at the time who or what caused the explosion that destroyed the USS Maine, the press ran with the story that Spain was behind it. It is now commonly believed, by the way, that the explosion was most likely caused by an internal malfunction. But the narrative was out. Politicians and the public caught on. And soon, America was at war with Spain. Just over a century later, another false narrative led the U.S. into another war. This one was aided by bad intelligence at best and a politically expedient lie at worst that Saddam Hussein had an active program for and large stockpiles of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Those are just two examples from American history where lies or false narratives, where getting it wrong had serious consequences. Wars were started. Lives were lost. This week, President-elect Trump, as he often does to make announcements and comments on events, took to his own social media platform, Truth Social, to react to the New Year's Bourbon Street attack in New Orleans, which killed 15 people, including the attacker. In the immediate aftermath of the attack, Trump, who has called immigration from the southern border an invasion, suggested that, quote, Biden's open border policy was to blame for the New Orleans attack. And while it turns out that the only borders the attacker crossed were state lines, he was a U.S. citizen and an Army veteran from Texas. Trump has not issued any corrections or changes to his posts, and his false claims have been echoed by several Republican members of Congress, notably by the House Speaker, Mike Johnson. So Trump, in this case, was responsible for spreading misinformation online about a terror attack on U.S. soil. But in a couple of weeks, once he's back in office, Trump will be shaping more than public opinion. He'll be commanding the focus of America's defense, intelligence, and law enforcement apparatus. It won't just be his Truth Social followers who are fed a false narrative and his congressional allies under pressure to repeat it. It will be the full force of the American government. Joining me now is Senator Gary Peters, the Democrat of Michigan, ranking member of the Homeland Security Committee. Senator, good to see you. Thank you for being with us. You know, this one kind of got away from me because many of us don't look to Donald Trump for real information about things, particularly on his social media. But it is kind of wild that a former president who's been elected to be the next president of the United States felt it okay to put wrong information out there that suits his political purposes, but actually wasn't accurate about a terrorist attack.
It is. It's irresponsible. There's no question about that. And it's, as you mentioned, it's one thing about being irresponsible if you're just on social media, and we should all take everything we see on social media with a grain of salt. But he is going to become president of the United States very shortly and will be responsible for keeping us safe. And you need to have accurate information to be able to address that problem. False narratives don't solve real problems. And when it comes to domestic terrorism, it is a real problem that we have to deal with. In fact, I have worked when I was chair of Homeland Security to force our intelligence agencies, the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, and others to provide data as to what are the terrorist threats that we face in this country. And clearly we have to keep our eye on foreign terrorism. That's something that is always present. But it was also clear was that most of the terrorist attacks that we see in our country are actually domestic terrorism. They're U.S. citizens that have either been radicalized from outside sources or they're part of extremist groups, whether those are white supremacist or anti-Semitic groups, and as a result of that engage in terrorist activities. And with data, we are able to appropriate resources appropriately and make sure that we have the people and law enforcement folks focused on the real problem. And when you have a president who is off on false narratives, we're not going to be able to deal with what is indeed a very serious problem in this country.
Right. Now, the good thing is there are a lot of people in the law enforcement and the intelligence and the Homeland Security and the anti-terrorism infrastructure who are devoted to this, right? During Donald Trump's first term in office, there were at least some people, both appointed and some career employees, who did act as bulwarks, even as whistleblowers when they felt necessary. Talk to me now, because Donald Trump has a few appointees, potential appointees to intelligence and law enforcement arenas. They're a little worrisome. Are you worried about the fact that he will have people to do his bidding?
Yeah, I'm very worried about that. We are looking at folks in key positions in national security and homeland security that simply don't have the expertise or the background to really manage these agencies. And if they're just there to do whatever the president wants, that's not their job. They need to approach that position with responsibility, work with experts that are in those agencies to make sure that they're actually protecting American citizens. And we'll find out. We're going to go through the confirmation process in the next few days. We're going to be asking a lot of tough questions, and we're going to expect thoughtful answers from these nominees. From what I've heard so far, I don't think we should expect those thoughtful answers coming back. I hope they are, but if they're not, we have to make sure that we're pushing back and hope that we can get people in these key positions who are professionals, understand the challenges that we face, and act accordingly.
So there was some
concerned that that's not what we have right now.
There was some attempt by the president to bypass that process, assuming that you get to interview these particular candidates in the Senate. What do you hope? What does success look like for those who are not qualified? In other words, what does success look like to you? Is it that those hearings, in some cases, get televised, or that the American public sees their answers to specific questions about Homeland Security, intelligence, defense, and law enforcement questions, so that the public can make a determination as to whether these people are qualified or not?
Yeah, absolutely. These need to be open. First, we have to get information. There was some question as to whether or not there would be FBI background checks. That seems to be happening right now. We have been interviewing these nominees, but ultimately, we've got to get them on camera in front of the American public for Americans to see who these individuals are, what makes them tick, how they're going to approach the problem set that they have been given in this administration, and make a determination whether or not they're qualified to actually do the job. And then, obviously, my hope would be that some of my Republican colleagues would also come to that same conclusion, because it'll be fairly clear, I think, in some cases. But they're going to need to have the political will and the courage to vote what they believe is right for the country, and not necessarily what Donald Trump wants.
Senator Peters, good to see you. Thank you for joining us this morning. The Democratic Senator Gary Peters of Michigan.